Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for taking time out of your schedule for this gathering. I am Jerry Park, Associate Professor of Sociology here at Baylor, and with me is Dr. Jamal-Dominique Hopkins, Associate Professor of Christian Studies, Director of the Black Church Studies Program. Dr. Hopkins and I are a part of a team of scholars and librarians here at Baylor who have helped put together this exciting year-long series framed around a work by one of the leading minds and public intellectuals of the late 19th and 20th centuries, Dr. W.E.B. DuBois. First, I'd like to personally thank and acknowledge our team, Dr. Stephanie Boddy, Associate Professor of Church and Community Ministries, jointly appointed in the School of Social Work, the School of Education, and Truett Theological Seminary, and the originator of this ambitious series of events. Would you join me in giving her a shout out? Thank you so much. So good. Dr. Jamal-Dominique Hopkins, who we just introduced, Dr. Ronald Johnson. Dr. Johnson, are you here? Oh, could make it. Okay. He is the Ralph and Bessie May Lynn Chair of History. Mr. Ezra Cho, where are you located? Right back there. Religion and philosophy librarian, Sine Wood. Sine, are you here? I know you're around here. She's in the back. Okay. So, social librarian. We also want to acknowledge the tremendous support of Dr. Stephen Reed, Vice Provost for Faculty Diversity and Belonging, and Mr. Carl Flynn in the back there, Director of Marketing Communications for IT and the libraries. Please join me in thanking all of these folks who have worked tirelessly to make this happen. Thank you all. Now, before we begin, we want to respectfully acknowledge that Baylor University in Waco and its original campus in Independence are on the land and territories originally occupied by indigenous peoples, including the Waco and Tawakoni of the Wichita and affiliated tribes, the Tonkawa, the Comanche, Karankawa, and Lipan Apache. These indigenous peoples were dispossessed of and removed from their lands over centuries by European colonization and American expansionism. In recognition that these native nations are the original stewards of Baylor's campus locations, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign native nations and indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. And we also want to extend our thanks to the Office of the Provost, the University Libraries, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Diana R. Garland School of Social Work, the Law School, the School of Education, External Affairs, Institute for Faith and Learning, Truett's Black Church Studies Program, the Ethnic Studies Program, Women and Gender Studies Program, and Departments of History, Religion, Sociology, and Journalism, Public Relations, and New Media. Thank you all. We're here today to learn about an American intellectual figure whose importance and relevance is finally gaining the attention he deserved many decades ago. To be sure, certain quarters of American academic circles knew of Dr. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, but even in those few circles, he was not often mentioned beyond a few ideas that have animated and framed many studies in sociology, history, religion, social work, literature, ethnic studies, to name a few. In my academic circles, Du Bois's contributions have often been overlooked or ignored in the pantheon of founding fathers of sociology, despite being their contemporaries. Du Bois was 15 when Karl Marx died. He was 49 when Emil Durkheim died at 59, and 52 when Max Weber passed at age 56. He was the first African-American to be invited to present a paper at the American Historical Association in 1909. The organization would not invite another African-American speaker until 1940. It would not be until 2015 with the publication of sociologist Dr. Alden Morris, The Scholar Denied, and Dr. Earl Wright II's The First American School of Sociology, Du Bois, and the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory, that we gained a systematic view not only of Du Bois's scholarly contributions, but the social context in which he undervalued or ignored altogether. Most notably, their reviews of historical evidence suggest that Du Bois founded the first school of sociology in the United States at Atlanta University, one of the leading HBCUs at the time, and preceded the legendary Chicago School of Sociology during its high point in the early 1900s. The Chicago School would take credit for multiple methods pioneered first by Du Bois, with no acknowledgement. Such exclusion would travel forward in time where generations of sociology graduate students and faculty would come to see the origins of American sociology as largely absent any Black scholars, all the while taking credit for ideas first shared by Du Bois. I digress. So, who is Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois? A Wikipedia search will tell you that W.E.B. Du Bois, pronounced Du Bois, not DuBois, something that was very important to him, was an American sociologist, historian, Pan-Africanist, civil rights activist, and socialist. He was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, to one of the only Black families in this small, nearly all-white town of about 4,300 residents. He attended Fisk University, one of the famous historic Black colleges and universities in Nashville, Tennessee. He did so with the generous support of his home church. He was the first African-American to earn a PhD at Harvard. To provide some context, the first African-American to get a PhD in religion at Baylor was in 1992. The first African-American to get a PhD in sociology at Baylor was in 2010. He first taught at Wilberforce University, a college sponsored by the historically Black denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, for about 2 years. As I mentioned earlier, he taught at HBCU Atlanta University in 2 periods of his life, from 1897 to 1910 as faculty in the history and sociology departments, and then returned between 1934 and 1944 to chair the sociology department. In 1909, he co-founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, known today as the NAACP. For those who are curious, it was Du Bois who had advocated for the term colored rather than the original term Black to be more inclusive of, in his words, dark-skinned people everywhere. Words matter, don't they? From 1910 to 1934, he was the editor of the NAACP's periodical, The Crisis, which only recently ended its publication run in 2021. He moved to Ghana at the remarkable age of 93 and passed away there 2 years later in 1963. Dr. Du Bois lived through a seismic era that still affects us today. He lived from 1868, just 3 years after the end of the Civil War in 1865. He lived through the era of Reconstruction after Civil War, the Jim Crow era. There we go. He read about the passage of anti-immigration legislation in the late 1880s and 1920s, World War I, the women's suffrage movement, and the passage of the 19th Amendment. He witnessed the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan, the Tulsa Massacre that leveled what was called Black Wall Street and took the lives of at least 300 African Americans. His life overlapped the majority of the era of lynching, in which more than 4,000 Black men and women lost their lives to mob racial violence. For us here in Waco, we should be reminded that he was one of many journalists to cover the lynching of Jesse Washington not too far from Baylor in 1916. And yes, that is indeed a photo of Burleson Hall featured in Du Bois's article. The story of how Du Bois's team was able to actually get these photos of this horrific event is a story in and of itself. He lived through the Great Depression, World War II, the Korean War, the first 8 years of the 20-year Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which almost started World War III. He lived through Brown versus the Board of Education. He saw much of the civil rights movement and the hundreds of acts of civil disobedience and the murder of Emmett Till. He died in 1963, the night before the famous March on Washington, where King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Some have argued that Du Bois's passing marks the passing of the torch to the next generation of civil rights leaders. 2 weeks later, the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama would be bombed by white supremacists, killing 4 Black girls. A year after his passing, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed. And the year after that, Malcolm X is assassinated. And 3 years after that, Dr. King is assassinated. Du Bois was a contemporary to some of our most well-known civil rights leaders and present to some of its most consequential moments. Du Bois witnessed all of this. But more than witnessing passively, he responded through the ways his gifts best allowed, by documenting, reporting, and spreading the news of important events related to the unequal treatment of African Americans, critiquing and denouncing racist views publicly stated by leading white political, economic, and cultural elites, advocating for the advancement of African Americans by proposing strategic inroads into American institutions, such as the creation of military officer opportunities, most of which were dismissed and ignored by white elites, and international organizations, including the United Nations, organizing public demonstrations against anti-Black violence, and making visible the contributions of Black Americans to a largely white, privileged public that remained intentionally and systematically ignorant of their significance to the economic prosperity that they enjoyed. Of his 24 listed nonfiction books, Du Bois's best known ones include The Philadelphia Negro, published in 1899 when Du Bois was just 31 years old. And by the way, this year is also the 125th anniversary of that book. 4 years later, The Souls of Black Folk in 1903 and Black Reconstruction in America in 1935. He also served as editor of the periodical The Crisis, which reported on news particularly relevant to African Americans, but should have been relevant to many more. Oh, I skipped ahead too far. Sorry about that. And for those who have heard about the term data visualization, you are recommended to see the collected data portraits of Du Bois, which we have featured down here. Keep in mind, he made these illustrations by hand with no computers, digital graphics creations, or algorithms. He created them just freehand using special drawing tools, pens, coloring pencils, and paper, and of course, data. He also wrote 5 fiction novels, an autobiography, and poetry. Du Bois, like many of the professors in this room and watching from around the country, was a multi-talented polymath. Now, one of his lesser-known works is The Gift of Black Folk, The Negroes in the Making of America. Published in 1924, hence the 100th anniversary that marks this occasion, The Gift of Black Folk takes us through American history as it was known at the time, with a twist that was not seen in nearly any other historical or sociological overview work at the time. That twist was bold and spoke prophetically to the white educated establishment. What was this twist? Centering American history, American progress squarely on the ignored and sidelined contributions of African Americans. As many of you already discovered, this book in its entirety is available for free online using the link provided at the Baylor Library's webpage for this event. If you like listening to books, there's a free audio link to this as well. Please have a read and assess for yourself whether Du Bois was right in pointing to the contributions of Black people in American history. So with this context in mind, let's have a conversation with Dr. Jamal-Dominique Hopkins, noted theologian, associate professor of Christian scriptures, director of the Truett Black Church Studies program. Dr. Hopkins earned his BA from leading HBCU Howard University, an MA from Fuller Theological Seminary, and his PhD from the University of Manchester. Prior to coming to Truett in 2022, he was the founding dean and associate professor of biblical languages and literature at the Christian Liberal Arts HBCU, Allen University's Dickerson Green Theological Seminary in Columbia, South Carolina. Dr. Hopkins holds a pedagogy fellowship with Yale University's Center for Faith and Culture, where he is part of the Christ and Being Human project, focused on revitalizing the Christian higher education. He is also a fellow with the Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies, where he is a part of the research group on the post-secular conception of science and was a contributor to the Defending Religious Freedom Initiative from 2015 to 2018. He has published numerous articles related to the Dead Sea Scrolls in biblical studies and Black religious thought. And his latest book came out in 2022, Cultic Spiritualization, Religious Sacrifice in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hopkins. Thank you for your time, Dr. Hopkins. Thank you. So could you share with us what excited you or introduced you to W.E.B. Du Bois?
You know, as you were reading and as I'm just thinking about this, I'm not quite sure outside of, I think Du Bois was just a name that was one of many names that I grew up with in my household, Southern California. And I think by the time I had, nearing the end of high school, entering college, Du Bois was one of those names that was very interested in continuing to explore and very quickly, especially with this volume of literature and this influence just kind of lingering, really captured my imagination and really, I think, animated my intellectual curiosity. Growing up in Southern California, among a number of things, entertainment, Hollywood, that I did dibbled and dabbled in a little bit of that. But I think it was Du Bois, among others, that animated my intellectual curiosity. And as I began to lean into that intellectual curiosity, I began to discover a world that I didn't even know I was interested in, or that there was just so much more. You talk about the gift of Black folks. It's just, yeah, it became a gift, intellectual life, a life of the mind. And so as I read, as I learned more about W.E.B's voice, I think it was the talented tenth, this concept that Du Bois popularized. Um, this idea that there would be those sons and daughters, African Americans, that would flourish in academics, flourish in arts, flourish in culture and literature, and that they would elevate the race, African American race. And so that imagination, that idea, that thought captured my imagination and resonated with me. And so I viewed myself on this quest as being a son of this talented tenth, a son of kind of a Du Boisian intellectual prowess, if you will.
Yeah. And was there any particular work, I guess you've already mentioned the talented tenth, was there a certain concept that fueled your interest in what you study now?
Yeah, and this, I do a lot of things in Second Temple Judaism, Dead Sea Scrolls, but there's this intersection, and I think as a Black scholar, I'm always curious and interested in how does scholarship intersect with where I come from, or my community. So it's an interesting story how I got into Dead Sea Scrolls, Second Temple Judaism. I was captivated by languages, and I couldn't decide whether or not I wanted to focus on biblical Greek or Hebrew. And so the study of the Dead Sea Scrolls allowed me to really kind of lean into both Greek and Hebrew. And I think it was just that appetite. I mean, reading some of Du Bois' works, and he taught Latin, Greek. I mean, so he was multilingual. You talk about polymath. And so, but I was curious, and questions that I brought to Second Temple Judaism, questions that I brought to Dead Sea Scrolls. I was interested in how does this speak to the Black community? How does this speak to the Black church from which I emerged from? And so some of my work has asked questions, kind of I think in the Du Boisian spirit. What do the Dead Sea Scrolls say to Black church? This idea. And so those are kinds of questions. Those are kinds of the lens that I look at my research and look at my scholarship. And so, but kind of backtracking a little bit even on that. So my first degree at Howard University was in film. So I did do some film, some acting and stage in Los Angeles growing up. And so I think with the interest in arts, and there's one particular essay Du Bois talks in, it's in The Gift of Black Folks, talking about art and literature. And I think it's the one particular essay, The Criteria of Negro Art, talking about all art is propaganda. All art tells a story. All art is meant to say something and meant to teach and to educate. And for Du Bois, art should be a way, I'm talking about art with music, with painting, with theater. It's meant to uplift and to elevate and to display. And I think, as The Gift of Black Folks talks about, the best of what the Black community has as a gift to the world, not just to self, not just to community, but as a gift to imagine if there was no Black music in American society.
Right.
Imagine if there was no Black athleticism or just, what's just named. So the contribution, and I think that's really what animated me, that I can contribute, and I can contribute at the highest level, and I can contribute in whichever arena that I find this kind of natural talent in. And for me, that was in religious theological studies.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. And you've been in several different HBCU contexts. Does Du Bois play a very central role in the life culture of each of these campuses?
It does. It does. And so, I had a great relationship with my parents, but a young boy growing up in the father's house, right? There's only room for one, one big dog in there. And so I said, so I started, going to school, and my dad said, if you want to go to a Black college, I'll pay for it. So being in Southern California, in Los Angeles, looked on the map and said, where's the furthest Black college? Right from Los Angeles, California. So I landed at Howard University. But it was there that I think what I began to read about in DuBois, I began to see that and to live that and to experience that. Black professors, Black administrators, peers in the classroom. And it was just this kind of healthy environment that allowed me to discover what was in me. Academically, intellectually. I often say it wasn't until I got to Howard University that I first learned to write a paper, that I first learned to really read a book all the way through and to comprehend it. It was at Howard University. I was 23 years old. So growing up in a California context didn't quite, focus on that, but being at Howard University, it really allowed me to flourish and grow. And I think that's because of the spirit of W.E.B. Du Bois and his work.
Wonderful. That's wonderful.
And so, I've been able to, I was a student at Howard University at HBCU. One of my first professor was at an HBCU context in Atlanta, and then as an administrator in Columbia, South Carolina. So kind of seeing all sides of that context and that world that I think Du Bois, because Du Bois, he taught at Atlanta University and Atlanta HBCU. He taught at Wilberforce, short, brief stint in Ohio, HBCU, which is in the AME context. So I felt that I truly was living and kind of embodying as a son of this talented tent, as a son of this idea that captured his imagination and animated me. And it wasn't until I didn't realize a lot of this until just kind of self-discovery as I was living in it, kind of in the moment. But when I was doing my doctorate at the University of Manchester in England, my flat was not too far from the University of Manchester, but I would ride my bike or walk from my flat to the campus. But so in between the University of Manchester, so Manchester is kind of situated as it's a large university town. And between the University of Manchester, Manchester Metropolitan University, the Royal School of Music, and there's a couple other colleges, there's about 72,000 student population in the city of Greater Manchester, Manchester and surrounding areas. But I noticed that I would walk by a building I wasn't sure if it was occupied, but there were plaques on this building. And one moment I attribute to the Holy Spirit. Something told me to stop and look at these signs. And so I walked up to this one particular building and I looked at the sign and there was a plaque. And on the plaque, it said the 5th Pan-African Congress was here in Manchester, England, at this site. The 5th Pan-African Congress. W.E.B. Du Bois was present. Nkrumah was present. Jomo Kenyatta was present. Amy Garvey was present. And I looked at that sign and I said, how is this coincidental? It's like I'm living and kind of walking in the shadow of Du Bois, if you will. So not just his work and his writing and his, it animated my imagination, but it's like I'm now walking in the shadow. And only to find out that, Du Bois, he spent some time in Southern California and he actually came to my hometown. Of course, I wasn't around. But his first trip was in 1913. And he writes about this in the Crisis magazine, the NAACP Crisis magazine. And he talks about the beauty of California. And he talks about how Blacks live in Southern California. This is 1913. And he talks about the roses and the orange groves and this kind of utopia. He kind of paints Black life, but he's contrasting this with what Black life is like in 1913 in the South, in the East. And so it was not uncommon for Blacks, and there were lots of mulattoes because California was not annexed into the United States till 1850. So you had Blacks owning property, mulattoes owning property, owning businesses, wealthy Blacks flourishing in the California context in 1913. And so this captures his imagination. He writes about this. This is the same hometown that I'm in. And of course, he comes more other times. And but it just discovering this kind of self-discovery, walking in the shadow of DuBois, almost this kind of provenance, if you will. I don't know. But it just really continues to animate me.
Given what you've read about Du Bois's experience in Southern California in 1913, and having grown up in the same area, do you feel that the prosperity, the opportunity that he saw back then was still present while you were growing up for African Americans?
Yeah, so California
had things changed?
Well, so California was an interesting spot, and I think it probably even has what I grew up in. There were aspects of that as well. So Du Bois comes back into Southern California in 1923, and it's around 1923 that a young family from Rome, Georgia, comes and makes their way to Pasadena, California, escaping the South of Georgia. And this is the family of Jackie and Mac Robinson. And so they find their way to Pasadena, and it's around this time that Du Bois is around, coming around. And so there's not necessarily this connection, but it's something in the air that, and you read about in Du Bois's papers that he would address large crowds, not uncommon, something like this of multi-ethnic persons and crowds. And of course, this was he went to Occidental College to speak crowds there. He went throughout Southern California speaking to these multi-ethnic, multicultural crowds, addressing them. But it was also Booker T. Washington would come and speak to these large crowds as well. Albert Einstein was in and out of Pasadena, Caltech, and their paths would cross. And I talk about that a little bit later. But it was something in the air, and kind of going back to Black church roots in a sense that it was the Azusa Street revival in 1903 that happened in Los Angeles, which is about 15 miles south of Pasadena, where this captured a multi-ethnic male, female, white, Black, Asian. It captured this kind of crowd that I think was conducive to California, where you had a lot of various diversities and ethnicities. I mean, that just was a California culture. And I think that's something that Du Bois spoke on, particularly that animated him to write in the 1913 edition of the Crisis magazine. And so when, in the 20s, schools were integrated in California. And so, you look at Jackie Robinson's story when he starts school in the 20s, 30s, he's going to school with whites, Blacks, Mexicans, that, because Asians, he's going to school with all of these. And he actually talks about in some of his writings, or some of the writings about Jackie Robinson, he hung out with this group called the Pepper Street Gang. The Pepper Street Gang, they would do like kind of petty crime thing, throw rocks at cars, steal oranges from orange stands, things like that. But it was this multi-ethnic group of kids running around Pasadena, Old Town Pasadena, and just kind of wreaking havoc in that particular day. But it was very much a diverse context, and I think that's really what identified and what Du Bois was actually known for as well.
Yeah. And did you see that when you were growing up?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I went to high school. All of my schooling, it was very diverse, which provided I think, a rich context for learning about other peoples and cultures. And I remember my street that I lived on, every Saturday morning, my brother and I, we would love to walk down the block because there was this kind of like a farm type thing. There was an older Mexican gentleman and his grandkids would come around, and they had chickens and corn, and we would just love to kind of be there and just kind of wander through his garden, and just listen to the music. And it was just, I mean, that just was my context, my culture.
Yeah,
Yeah.
wonderful, wonderful. If we can pivot a little, you've spoken a couple of times that Du Bois has had interactions with the historically Black church in the United States, most especially the African Methodist Episcopal Church. What did Du Bois have to say about the church, if you could summarize it from what you've read about Du Bois?
Yeah, so I think the question within more modern recent scholarship has been asking the question, what was Du Bois's relationship to the church? Some have, and I think historically it said that there was tension, it was fraught. There's a story Du Bois is chronicled talking about. It's one of his first years or semesters at Wilberforce University, this AME, predominantly HBCU in Ohio. And as they're opening the convocation, the president turns to Du Bois and says, Dr. Du Bois will offer this morning's prayer. And Dr. Du Bois says, no, I won't. And of course, you know, the president has cleaned that up. But so this, I think that, you know, Du Bois had this understanding and reverence or respect for the church because he knew that the church was out of which gave life and spoke to Black life and gave spirit and gave hope to Black life, especially within a kind of oppressive, you know, American context. And so I think he acknowledged that. He spoke about that because to talk about Black life, to talk about Black folks, talk about the souls of Black folks, you got to talk about the spirit, the religion, the faith of Black folks. And Du Bois honored that. He respected that, and he leaned into that. You know, one of his texts, the Negro Church, prayers for dark people. So it's kind of this riff on Black life, and you can't separate Black life from Black faith and the Black church. And so I think there was this reverence for that. So, Du Bois talked about a double consciousness in his work, classic work, The Souls of Black Folks.
And that's a key concept, by the way,
yeah.
double consciousness.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to.
No, please.
Yeah, but I think there's another aspect to this, maybe a triple consciousness. What does it mean to be Black in American society when Blackness is suppressed, subjugated to a whiteness? To be Black, but to look through the lens of Blackness, almost kind of look through the lens, this kind of double lens, double consciousness. To be a two-ness, to be American, but not to be American, to be Black, to be. But I think there's this other aspect that I think Du Bois flirted with maybe implicitly, but there's this also faith life of Black folks, which really animated a kind of otherworldly reality that was very much prevalent within Black life. And I think Du Bois really, I think he understood whether, you know, speaking to that specifically, not as explicit, but I believe there was that other aspect that potentially there was this flirtation with, that Du Bois flirted with, that I think a lot of the other works kind of implicitly hinted at, if you will.
Yeah. So it's clear that Du Bois has had a national influence, an international influence, and an influence in the church.
Yes.
From all of that, let's pivot towards the conversation that we're going to have through the rest of this semester and next semester as we talk about one of his lesser known works, The Gift of Black Folk. Dr. Hopkins, what would you say are some important things we should think about with regard to that book as we go from webinar to webinar through the coming year?
So I kind of want to set this up in a couple of ways. So I brought a copy of my book. I talked about Albert Einstein and W.E.B. Du Bois, their paths intersected. And I think this is part of this gift. And I think this is part of what the gift of Black folks really embodies. But you talk about the introduction to Du Bois, and Du Bois spent all of his life fighting for the human rights and fighting for integration, fighting for Black uplift as a gift for American society. But in 1961, Du Bois I want to read actually a letter that he sends a dear friend of his. Her name is Grace Goins and her husband is William Goins.
So he's about 90 at this point.
He's
He
91.
passes, yeah,
Yeah, he's
63.
91. This is September 13th, 1961. And so he first encounters Grace and William Goins in 1947 when Grace Goins invites Du Bois to a YWCA luncheon. And so the letter that's is still preserved in the Du Bois Library collection. He's offered $50 if he's going to come and speak, if the budget would allow. He said, but if the budget won't allow, he's being offered $35 to speak, and that the good graces and the warmness of their heart will pay up the rest. So that's the letter. They don't try that today. But Du Bois writes this letter, 1961, September 13th, said, "Dear Grace, your letter of September 7th makes me so mad that I hasten to reply. I just cannot take any more of this country's treatment. We leave for Ghana October 5th, and I set no date for return. If I were you, I'd try to buy nothing more, but save, and in time, leave. We have been lucky. We have sold our house at a good price after 10 years among nice folks. We, though, how gladly I remember those lovely days at 409, his address. Then he says, chin up and fight on, but realize that American Negroes can't win. I read this letter after writing it, and it occurs to me that this is one heck of a missive to send to a weeping friend. So buck up. Most people in this country today are worried to death. So eat, drink, and be merry. I am celebrating by going to my dentist and then out to dinner. We sell October 5th for Ghana. Between then and now, phone us when you'll be in town. Love, Du Bois." And so I set this up. This was Du Bois' letter to a dear friend. He spends all of his life working towards making America great. The gift of Black folks is about how great America already is. And so Du Bois, this intersection, and that his love for, I think, democracy, his love for the uplift, his love for the gift of Black folks as a gift to America. These correspondence, he begins a correspondence with Albert Einstein in 1930, where he invites Albert Einstein to write for the Crisis magazine, this NAACP magazine. He invites Albert Einstein. And so Einstein, he writes this short paragraph in German, which Du Bois translates and places within the Crisis magazine. And this is a relationship that's cultivated on the very last correspondence between Albert Einstein and W.E.B. Du Bois is 1951. Einstein writes a letter before this because if you remember, W.E.B. Du Bois he's placed on trial for he's being accused of being a communist, and so he has to go before the court. But Albert Einstein writes the court and writes Du Bois, and he offers to serve as a character witness for Du Bois, at which the court case is dropped. And so I think that's the gift that Du Bois offers us today, gift to Black folks. I think that's the gift. So imagine your first gift that you receive, whether it be a Christmas gift or a birthday gift. Imagine there's a gift for you waiting for you at home. And when you get home, that gift will be there for you. How would you feel? How do you feel when you receive a gift? Yeah. And I think that's what Du Bois has given us in this work, the gift of Black folks. It's a contribution, not just what Blacks have contributed to American society, but also what Black folks have contributed. You talked about the history, the science, and art and culture, in faith, religion. I mean, we have a Black Gospel Archives downstairs here at Baylor University. That's the gift of Black folks, that all of us, has everybody been to the Black Gospel Archive? Who hasn't been down in the Black Gospel? So today, when you leave, after you get your lunch, you'll go down to the Black Gospel Archives and you'll see. And when you see that, you'll think of the gift of Black folks. You think of the work that DuBois laid down as a foundation to give a gift to make where we are today possible. And so I think this is a gift that everyone should read, because the more I think you get into this, the more we really learn about ourselves. And we learn about how, like my experience going to Howard University, I didn't know what was in me. I didn't know that I had this academic prowess within me until I actually explored and opened the gift. I think if you begin to explore this and definitely attend these webinars over the course of the academic year, you'll begin to learn something more about yourself. And I think that's the gift that continues to keep giving, that DuBois. I think you talk about in biblical texts, there's prophets. Prophets wrote prophecies, but there were prophecies that maybe they didn't know the full realization of, but later on communities know. And I think there's something here that you can learn about yourself that maybe didn't capture his imagination necessarily fully, but I think you'll see once you get into this.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And yeah, one of the things that jumps out to me as I read through the book was just the recognition of how DuBois wants all of us to remember that history is not just about great men in particular, but it's actually about great people, people whose names have probably been lost to history, but whose collective influence has actually changed so much of what makes us where we are today. Without putting too much of a fine point on it, in a sense, I feel like he is speaking historically and academically and saying that Black lives matter. They have not been included in our histories. They have not been included in the way we retell what is the American story. In his book, The Gift of Black Folk, he introduces African Americans back into the history that actually was theirs to begin with, right? And if we really are inclusive as Americans, it is all of our history, except that their story has often been neglected, made absent, or invisible. And he's bringing it to the fore. So I've really appreciated his contribution in that regard.
And I would call it a kind of maybe a corrective historiography.
Yes.
You know, he dies on the eve of the March on Washington, almost passing this torch to a new generation, and recognizing that and making room for that, making space for the next generation. That's a gift.
That's right. That's right. And to, I think, put a little bookend to today's conversation, we thought we could end with a quote from DuBois himself. This is his actual voice in the following, if it will click. There we go. I'll try to hit one more time.
Of course, this problem of mob violence and of disfranchisement and of injustice in the courts and of difficulties of getting decent jobs. It's all that. But the students put their finger on that and they fought. It was hard fighting. Well, that gives me a good deal of satisfaction. Evidently, the older people like myself are not needed just now. They're younger people who are going on and doing their own thinking. And I congratulate them on it. They don't need any advice from me. Perhaps I need some from them.
It's a very fitting way for DuBois to, in a sense, commission us to read from some of the things he's written over the past lengthy part of his academic professional career. We have time for some Q&A right now. Are there any questions? And I think we have a special kind of a microphone that we're going to pass around. Is that right? Something called a chat box. Is everybody familiar with the use of that? Okay, yeah, I see a hand over there.
I may or may not need it.
Okay. I think we're good. We're streaming.
Thank you so much
Yes.
for your remarks.
I hate that you passed the real HU in Virginia and went on over there to Howard. I will forgive you for it, though.
My colleague is from the real HU too, but.
We are, you know we are, but you don't want to. Anyway, can you say a little bit about some of the work of Carter G. Woodson and as it supported and sprang up because of the same reasons that Du Bois was writing about the situation in America as it affected Black people, about the need for us to learn our history, to be planted within American history, and to advocate for and fight for our civil rights?
Yeah, so Carter G. Woodson, E. Fraser Franklin. So there was this generation after Du Bois who also did their trainings at Harvard University, like him. And there was something about attending an HBCU and then going to an Ivy League, which is what they followed it kind of in Du Bois's track. And so while I didn't necessarily go to the Ivy League at the master's level, I was able to go to overseas, University of Manchester in England. And Du Bois spent time in Germany. We're learning the tools of sociology. And so there was this need really, and their project was about enlightenment, education. I mean, I'm thinking of this biblical text without knowledge, people perish. And so that very much was I think, a biblical idea and understanding that animated them. And so that's what the HBCUs were committed to doing. So in Carter G. Woodson's classic text, in this Education of the Negro, really, well, like I said, this one is kind of this corrective historiography. And so if we think of the works, Bois, Fraser Franklin, Carter G. Woodson, these are treaties, these are tomes, these are what I call maybe literary epistles that aren't necessarily meant to be combative, but they're meant to correct kind of a corrective historiography, which now allows society to see how great it really is. To suppress a people group is almost to suppress yourself. And to learn about a people group. If I contribute my gifts to an institution, that institution becomes that much greater. We all celebrate that. And that was the work Carter G. Woodson was attempting to do, Du Bois was attempting to do. And those early Alain Locke, those early Black intellects. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I see a hand here. Can we pass the box?
You can actually throw it. Yeah, you can toss it.
Speak like that? Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Firstly, would like to say thank you for your contributions and thank you for your time. So I was listening in as you were in the beginning, as you were talking about your discoveries within Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls. I wanted to ask that, so essentially I make an assumption right now that you would have not converted, but also looked into some forms of Christianity, right? So with that being said, I know that as you were reading, you would probably see like Jesus as he spoke to both Jews and Gentiles, Martin Luther King as he spoke to Negroes and whites, Du Bois as he did the same thing. I wanted to ask, is there anything that within your research or within your discoveries or within your writing that you have found, I guess, most attributable and things that non-Blacks can cherish because at the end of the day, as you said, we all benefit each other. So if there's anything that you found that non-Blacks can cherish and hold on to, that even us as Blacks can also listen to, similar to Lee as Jews listen to the preaching to the Gentiles and Negroes to preaching to the whites.
Yeah, so I love that question. Thank you so much for that. In a lot of my classes, I try to introduce, and so I come up with this idea of corrective historiography. This is a term that Kane Hopefelder often used. Kane Hopefelder was a New Testament professor at Howard University. And so he talked about Afrocentricity as a kind of multiculturalism. It's not meant to necessarily privilege and favor African American life or thought, but it's meant to provide this kind of multi-ethnic or this multiculturalism that we're all part of. I mean, we're all swimming in the same pool, if you will. And so in my studies, I look at aspects of Judaism and strands of African Judaism. Because when you look at biblical texts, Matthew chapter 2, for instance, where Herod, the Great, so it's very historical, there's historical information, where the dream comes to Jesus' father, he takes him to Africa, to Egypt. And so if you look in classical Jewish writings and literature, you find that there's actually a Jewish community in Leontopolis, Egypt, that escapes from this civil strife that's going on at the hands of the Maccabees and they're fighting with the Syrians. And so you have this African Jewish community, and archaeology bears that out because they find a Jewish temple in Egypt, Leontopolis, Egypt. Matter of fact, if we go back even further, there's Jewish temples and communities back in the 5th and 6th century before Christ in Lower Egypt. And so as my lens, I'm looking for those kinds of points of interest. I mean, I kind of discover, because I think if you're doing research, the research will kind of discover you. I think sometimes we often try to do the research, but instead of allowing us to be in discovery mode, we try to impose upon research, impose our, and then I think we might recolor, hence the miseducation of, fill in the blanks. But allowing and digging into research, you begin to discover and find things. And if you're a true, genuinely lover of knowledge, you'll go on that exploration and you'll be open to whatever you find and go into that and lean into that. And I think that's really the spirit of Du Bois. That's the spirit of, I think, a lot of these early Black intellects, which we could really learn a lot from. Yeah, appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I see a hand back there. Yeah, if we can pass all the way down.
Yes, you alluded a little to the relationship with W.E.B. with the AME Church. But can you talk a little about what he felt was the role of the church in the struggle for Black people during his time or related to the time now?
Yeah, I think he understood, it's very pivotal, that you can't separate Black life from Black faith. And it has always been Black faith that has anchored Black life, Black community, a faith in God, prayer life. And so Du Bois recognized that, which is why I think, you look at the souls of Black folks and you have these prayers or these songs that begin each chapter. And I think that is an acknowledgement that you can't divorce the two. You can't divorce Black life from faith. And so I think he respected that. I think he revered that. I mean, yeah, outside of that, we don't necessarily see him as like, taking a leadership role within any particular church denomination, but I think he reverenced, and I think there was the acknowledgement there in his writings, in his contributions. Does that get it?
Oh, yeah. Some questions from Zoom.
Oh, Zoom questions?
Hi, yes. On behalf of Luke Arnold, he's wondering, what would you say was the most surprising or unexpected choice from Du Bois during his academic career? And what impact did it have compared to his other acts?
So I often get the question, how come we don't see Martin Luther King Jr. talking about or referencing Du Bois? Well, Du Bois spends a second stint in Atlanta teaching at Atlanta University. That stint ends in 1943.
Something like that, yeah.
In the spring of 1943. In the fall of 1943, Martin Luther King Jr. starts his Morehouse college education. So they miss each other in this academic context by a semester. However, Du Bois was a giant, and the ideas and his thought was a giant, and he was a hero in the sense celebrated within a Black Atlanta in the 1940s, 1930s is, the time that he's there. And so he very much, I think, is accessible, Daddy King, because Du Bois would have been King's grandfather's generation, kind of in between the grandfather and father. And so he's a legacy, he's a giant. And so there's this intersection that I think takes place. I'm sorry, I'm looking at over here, the boys cave already. So there is that cross, there is that link, there is that, I think, this conversation that's taking place, probably maybe not necessarily publicly, but it's very much, I think, in the thought and the mind, and what prompts the work of King. The work of King is very much similar to the work of Du Bois. Du Bois had kind of many lives. I mean, from the integration to the Pan-Africanist to leaving and going to Ghana, very full, fruitful, flourishing life.
Do you think King didn't reference Du Bois in part because the FBI was watching both he and Du Bois? I've wondered that if there was something strategic in, I guess, if there was like too much attention on things that they thought maybe might take away from the civil rights movement.
Perhaps, but I do also think King was very much informed by the Black church, Black Baptist church, and theological education. And so when you look at writings on King, new works especially, they tend to try to center King in a kind of philosophical tradition, a philosophical background. But King was very much foundational, informed by Black Baptist church, Black church context, and theological education. And so Du Bois is social science. He's not informed necessarily by the church. He's in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He doesn't discover really what Black life is about until he goes to Nashville, to Fisk, and sees it up close. I mean, there's, he sees, up there in New England, but not like it's in the South.
Right.
And so, but this is what King's birthed into, and his grandfather, Baptist minister, his father's Baptist minister. King wants to be an attorney. But when he sees a brand, I say, of Christianity, if you will, coming out of Morehouse, Benjamin Elijah Mays, that you can be a Black religious minister, or you could be have Black faith and be a freedom fighter. That grabs King's attention, which I think was also, always the attention, because I think King and these freedom fighters, they wanted to champion and do a lot of the work that Du Bois and Thurgood Marshall. But how can one do that if one is a minister of faith? Like, I think Morehouse and that experience allowed him to see that you could be a freedom fighter and be one of the most educated, kind of wisdom sage leaders within the Black community, especially during enslavement, was the Black preacher, Black pastor, educated, faith, wise. So, yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Time for one more question. Okay. Yes.
Thank you for coming. It's always nice to hear from another SoCal resident.
Oh, yes. The right coast.
So, you mentioned that Du Bois was very aware of the power of art and imagery. So I just wanted to get your perspective on how do you think he influenced the image of the Black intellectual, and do you think he may have been deliberate in his presentation and his dress and how he looked to further that image?
Yeah, without reading too much into Du Bois, I think so. I think he was. I think what he tried to champion, the way I read him, is that art is scholarship, it's intellectual. that there shouldn't be a distinction. Like if you are a sculptor, if you are a poet, if you are in performing arts, and you have a contribution that speaks to society, the culture, um, um, that very much is an intellectual contribution as a commentary or a theological or a literary treatise, something. So I think that's what we can get from his engagement and his comments and contributions to talking about art and what art should be, because art has a message, and oftentimes, especially now in today's culture, it seems that carry a far more powerful message in culture than, you know, magazines or reading a book, unless it's online. So there's a responsibility for the artist. What's the message? How are you going to be responsible? Which I guess that's like Spike Lee's argument with Tyler Perry. but I mean, that's responsible. What's the responsibility of the artist? So I think DuBois speaks to that. Yeah, DuBois speaks to a lot of where we are today.
So this is the introduction into the gift of Black folk. And I want to thank you all for coming out. A couple of quick announcements. The conversation continues. First, for those that are getting cultural arts engagement credit, you click on that QR code over there. But this QR code over here will take you to registration to the webinars. We have 3 scheduled for this coming fall semester. We have 3 more coming up in the spring semester, all taking different sections of the gift of Black folk and expanding upon it with scholars, not only from Baylor, but from outside of Baylor online.
I don't know if that was like a delayed spark from DuBois or the QR code.
That's right. And we have a conversation or celebration, I should say, of DuBois happening right after this at 1:30 with some light refreshment. That will be in Moody 104. Thank you so much again for your time. Really appreciate you being out here. And thus ends today's introduction.